Welcome to the first ever podcast of the Platonists. On this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things Platonism, interviewing Platonists and other people in the spiritual world about Platonism. We'll be doing book reviews of Platonic books and also talking about contemporary issues and how Platonism relates to those contemporary issues. Today, we are talking to the founder of the classical wisdom tradition Telegram and talking about his new book, The Flower of the Mind. And there's going to be links in the description if you want to get that book. One of the great things he's done is offer that up for free as a PDF. And early next year, it should be available in print. But if you want to pick one of those up, go ahead and check out the links that we've included. And without further ado, enjoy the show. Well, thanks for joining. I appreciate you being here, and I'm excited to talk to you about it because I think what you're doing is really, really cool, and I think that it's important for people to hear about what you're working on because it's not one of those things that I think has been broadcasted far and wide, or not that many people are aware of it yet. But mainly wanted to talk to you about your book that you put together, and I just think that is going to be really, really helpful for people who are getting into Platonism for the first time and they want that kind of introductory work. I wrote Ascesis to try to be something like that, but I think you actually did a much better job as like kind of an intro to Platonism type of work. And, I believe that's kind of what the idea of it is, but I wanted to talk to you about just the title and kind of what it is really quick. So it's called Flower of the Mind, and it's a protrepticus. So I think those two things is maybe a good place to start. I think Flower of the Mind, it sounds like that's a Chaldean reference to the Chaldean oracles, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. So I have it here. This is like a test
Oh,
print. This is with
awesome.
the cover that you actually designed for me. So
Oh, that's beautiful.
so this is what it looks like. Yeah, Flower of the Mind is the main title. That's right. It's Chaldean oracles. It's usually more often it's translated as Flower of the Intellect,
Hmm.
but I sort of changed it to Mind just because I thought that sounded a little better as a title and whatnot. But
Mm.
Flower of the Intellect, which is basically the highest or one of the highest levels of the rational soul. So that's the overall title of the series. I'm thinking about currently. I'm planning this to be probably 6 volumes or maybe 7 volumes. And this so Flower of Mind is the overall title, and then Volume One is Protreptikos, which is a Greek word which means like encouraging or exhortatory. It was that's a word that's used, for example, Iamblichus has a work called Protrepticos.
Hmm.
It's translated usually as exhortation to philosophy, and so that's the title of volume one. The idea of the book, as you said, was to actually it started out as because I wanted to. For years, I wanted there to be some kind of text for pagans, something akin to a Bible, although I don't want to stretch that too much, but something like that, some kind of text that um, people into this kind of spiritual path could use and reference. And of course, there are many candidates for what that could be. I mean, we have Homer, of course, and the writings of Plato and so on and so forth, just within the Greco-Roman sphere. But none of that was very systematic. And there are also a lot of questions of, okay, if you say that the Iliad or the Odyssey are sort of the Bible, that's that's fine. But then you're just talking about epic poetry. So what exactly? I don't know what exactly does the average Joe do with that. So I kind of went through this process of thinking about that for over a long period of time, and then one day, sort of out of the blue, it occurred to me that that they have this in the Platonic tradition. There's this sort of scale of virtues, and I'm sure we can get into all this stuff, but
Hmm.
basically, at a high level, there's, this kind of thing about the scale of virtues, and that, uh, um, it's like sort of one step at a time. It's this hierarchical relation between different levels of virtue, and which I've known about that for a long time, but for whatever reason, it had never quite dawned on me that, oh, well, certain texts are associated with different levels in this scale. And if you go around and just say, okay, well, which texts are associated with this level, with that level, with that level, then you can just put them in a book. And
Oh,
so
wow.
basically that's the idea of this first volume. Was to say, okay, we know that one of the earlier parts of the scale of virtue is what they call civic virtue, or sometimes it's called political virtue. Uh, in the book, I just kind of used the term practical virtue.
Mhm.
But anyway, it's what that really is pretty much is just or, what you might call ordinary virtue, or the virtue of everyday life, uh, and that kind of thing. And that's more or less where you start. Technically, there are two before that, but more or less you start at the what they call political or ethical, or excuse me, civic or political uh, virtue. And so, uh, and this is to do with the cardinal virtues. They have the civic virtue, cardinal virtues of justice, wisdom, temperance, courage. But in any case, they had this idea that there were certain texts that were at this level. So the the better known ones would be like the golden verses of the Pythagoreans, for example, which is just a real short poem, about a couple pages. And another example would be the Handbook of Epictetus, which is like a fairly short Stoic work. And so I'd known about those for a long time, and I had even known that they were at the civic level, but for some reason I just never quite put two and two together until fairly recently. And then I started doing more research, and I realized that there were other texts that it wasn't just because the issue then was, okay, well, you got these two texts, but I mean, they're both pretty short. So those two together is maybe 40 pages, if that. And so that's not much of a Bible. And then so I was trying, so I was trying to say, okay, so what else are we? So I started going through this process of thinking about what was going to be in, uh, if there were any others, basically. And to my surprise, as I started digging around, I found a handful of other ones. I started out with noticing that you could add some of the other Pythagorean literature. So, for example, in Heracles's commentary on the golden verses, he quotes not obviously the golden verses, but he also quotes the Pythagorean sentences, which
Mhm.
is a anonymous um, collection of kind of maxims, I guess. So it's somewhat like the golden verses, and he quotes them at least a couple times. And so I took that as like an endorsement. Okay, well, clearly he's sort of endorsing these, so I can add those. And then there are also in the in Iamblichus's Protrepticus, or exhortation to philosophy, which I also decided to include in this. Uh, he says something similar to that. You kind of start with these like maxims or whatever you want to call them, uh, and then you move up. And he actually makes a distinction between these very basic maxims and the golden verses, which he puts at a slightly higher level. I don't really get into that level
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
clarity,
I think
but
I remember that part in the exhortation, where the maxims he kind of says have those like dual meanings, right? Where it's like There's a literal
Oh,
meaning to them and the more esoteric meaning to it, right?
mhm. Yeah, yeah, right. So there's like I think Akusmata, and then there's like the golden verses, and then there's these kind of like maxims and whatnot. Well, anyway, long story short, uh, I I I started sort of piecing these different texts together, or realizing, oh, there's actually more than I thought. Like I said, originally I just thought it was kind of golden verses in the handbook, which is cool, but then I realized, well, actually, there's other things like some of these other Pythagorean sayings, and also another example would be the works and days of Hesiod.
Hmm.
I I sort of by just dumb luck stumbled upon uh, a work which I had no idea about until maybe a year ago or something, that or probably less than a year ago, that there was Proclus, that there are some extant scholia on on the works and days by Proclus, and these have, as far as I
Hmm.
can tell, have never been translated into English, but
Do you mean
they're,
by Scholia, you mean like a commentary by Proclus about
yeah,
Hesiod?
yeah, it's basically a sort of it's somewhat fragmentary, but we
Hmm.
have these like kind of like margin notes basically, and by Proclus, and and they're totally legitimate as far as I know, and
Hmm.
and in any case, they have never been fully translated, so it's a little hard to deal with it. But I started looking around into that, and I found out that in there he says that basically he puts the works and days at this, or at least this my interpretation. I think
Hmm.
he's saying he calls them educational. He calls the works and days, specifically the works and days, educational.
Hmm.
Um, that's his term, and which I think would sort of map similarly here, and uh, but the theogony of Hesiod he puts at a much higher level along with Homer. So it would, in other words, higher in the sense of the scale of virtues. So it's not on the
Right.
civic level, but the works and days, at least how I interpret, I think he's putting it at that same kind of level with these other texts. And maybe I'll stop talking.
No, that's a good
Feel like that
start.
was a
Yeah.
lot.
Uh, Yeah, you gave like a good overview of everything that's in there. I mean, the book in general has that introductory part where I think your summary of Platonism that you put in the introduction is just great. It's really gives a great sum up of like if somebody was just coming into Platonism and hadn't really understood any of it, it gives you that. And then all of the works that you're talking about are just great introductory works. And it's cool because a lot of introductory works out there are secondary works. They're going to be something from somebody who is kind of compiling it and trying to explain it to the modern listener in a way that they maybe would understand. I think my book's kind of like that. But what I really like about this is it's not only an introduction to the tradition, but it's an introduction to these primary sources. And you're diving into it and finding that these are the works that were handed to people in antiquity when they wanted to learn about Platonism. When they entered a Platonic school, these are essentially the documents they would have been given and said, "Hey, read these first. You got to get, this part figured out before we move on to the next." And, I think what you're talking about with the scale of virtues is you're talking about the parts that are in Damascus, I think talks about this mostly, where those like the hierarchy of virtues that, it's like civic virtue, there's physical virtue, the purificatory, hieratic, it goes all the way up. And I think there's a 7 levels or so of those virtues. So I think that's super interesting on that whole part. So, you know, So this is part of a larger path, though. Then, so this is the civic part, kind of comes first, and where does it go from there? I mean, do you see this as being kind of a full system of Platonic practice or even Platonic education? Like, I guess, how do you view this kind of ladder that you go up?
Okay. Uh, yeah, I think it's a full system. I think you can think of it. There's probably at least two different metaphors you can use to think of it. You mentioned education. You can think of it in terms of education, which is a traditional way of thinking about it. You can also think of it in terms of purification. Um, and what I have, I think, learned is that to them, education and purification are basically synonyms. We don't really think of education like that these days. We have a much more kind of secularized idea of education as like a sort of jobs program or something along those lines.
Right.
But they didn't really, or at least the Platonists really didn't think about it like that. To them, education was, as I say, more or less a synonym of purification. And that's I think that's an idea that would strike modern people as a little odd. But that to them is how it worked because they tended to think of spiritual ascent as ascent through levels of consciousness or levels of uh, knowledge. And so, but in order to accomplish this ascent, you have to this ascent through levels of consciousness, increasingly higher levels of consciousness or knowledge. You have to sort of go through a purification process, a certain type of purification process. Actually, in the Scholia, Proclus says this very beautifully in reference to the works and days. He says that, in fact, if I recall, he's sort of comparing. Actually, what he's saying is that the works and days of Hesiod is a good uh, place to start before reading the Theogony. In other words, you should read the works and days before the Theogony.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
and uh, the reason, according to what Proclus says, the reason why is because the Theogony, he says, is telling you the about the cosmos and the divine cosmos. And of course, cosmos means order. The order, the divine order of the universe. And so that's the Theogony. Now he says, well, but you cannot, a person cannot understand the uh, the order of the universe if they are themselves not in order first. So,
Yeah.
uh, and so he says that first you must put yourself in order, and so this is he doesn't actually directly reference the scale of virtues, but I think it's kind of pointing at this idea that you have to do this gradual thing and gradual sort of movement up.
And
And
I kind of noticed that in what Damascus is talking about with the hierarchy of virtues, where, on the lower level, they are more personal. I think even one of the first steps was like a kind of like physical personal virtue, like getting your body in order was one of the first steps in the scales of virtues. And then, a lot of that's stuff that you're supposed to just learn from, growing up. You're ideally you kind of learn how to take care of your body as a child. And then as you go up, then you get into that civic virtue where it's kind of like, okay, how do you be a good family member? How do you be a good citizen of the world around you? And then from there, it goes up and up and up. And in a sense, you are kind of integrating yourself with the cosmos bit by bit by bit as you go up in this kind of scale of virtue. And I definitely see what you mean there in that respect. Like you have to do those beginning parts first, and then you can graduate, so to speak, to thinking about bigger issues. But I do notice as people are learning this stuff, there's almost the opposite effect that tends to happen, where a lot of people want to go for the most complicated metaphysical or mythical interpretation of these things before they even get their body in order or start focusing on their relationships with the people around them and their city and things like that.
I think you're exactly right. I think that in general, spirituality, not just with this stuff, but with anything, whether you're talking about New Age, or whatever it might be, I think there is this tendency to kind of want to jump to the cool stuff, and whether it's some kind of fancy meditation or rituals or astral travel or something or what
Right.
have you. But I mean, these are the things that kind of pique people's interest, which I understand, especially now when it comes to the Platonists and or even just the generally classical stuff. I think people who are perhaps more on the intellectual side, which I think probably most of us are, uh, uh, we just naturally gravitate to that stuff. And I think that's not bad or anything, but there is a kind of trap that gets set for some people where and I've struggled with this too because I want to get deep into the Proclus stuff and all
Sure.
that kind of thing and try to figure out, and it's like I did that with Plotinus too. And I think, there I don't want to say that's bad, but it's not the ideal, let's put it that way. And they
Hmm.
traditionally absolutely had this, they very much had this idea that you're supposed to do things in the proper order. And if you don't do them in the proper order, then you're going to have issues. You're going to have a number of issues. For one thing, you're probably just not going to have a clue what you're reading. If you jump into
Hmm.
Proclus, for especially Proclus of all things, but
Yeah.
even Plotinus or something, you're just not really probably going to get a lot out of it. And even if you kind of understood parts of it, gonna it's not gonna entirely benefit you. That was their view. But even from a completely just a purely uh, sort of academic intellectual perspective, you're going to have a really hard time, for example, understanding Plotinus deeply if you don't understand Aristotle first, because
Yeah.
Plotinus is very, although he was, of course, sort of the father of Neoplatonists, as they say sometimes, and all that kind of stuff. But he was very. There's a lot of Aristotle in Plotinus, and so if you don't really understand actuality versus potentiality, for example, which
For
is an
sure.
Aristotelian concept, then Plotinus is just gonna really not make a lot of sense. So anyway, just from a practical point of view, it doesn't make sense to jump in. Uh, from a spiritual point of view, it doesn't make sense. But even just from a practical point of view, it's not gonna you're not gonna get that much out of it. So I think there is this trap of just trying to jump into cool stuff, and one of the risks of doing one of the other risks of doing that is that it becomes more of a just kind of intellectual exercise or as a kind of hobby. It just kind of becomes a hobby,
Yeah.
and rather than a spiritual practice.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk to you about that because I think that's an interesting perspective that you have on it, uh, about the balance between between rationality and spirituality and what that really means. Because at some level, the rational is the spiritual within Platonism, and we don't see those as two separate opposing things, but there is also that danger there that we over intellectualize things, or we become so
Mm.
focused on something like metaphysics that we miss these other parts. And do you see this sort of ladder of virtue idea as maybe a corrective to that problem?
I think it's definitely a corrective to that problem, because I think part of the issue is just people kind of skipping beyond where they might really be. I mean, if you think about it, the what they're asking us to do, as I understand, is actually very difficult. And so, like, just the very beginning level of civic virtue is, I think there could be this tendency to almost dismiss that and say, oh, well, I learned all that when I was growing up or something like that. But actually, uh, first of all, this is a somewhat new spirituality in terms of people becoming aware of it more, and old, obviously, but new to
Mm,
people. And so people are not familiar with it. And so there's a lot of new ideas. So that's one thing. But also just they're actually asking quite a lot of us because, for example, to actually be ready to move beyond the sort of thing I'm talking about in volume one of my book, you have to pretty much be living like a Stoic. You have to be living according to the handbook of Epictetus. You have to be consistently doing that. You have to be consistently displaying the civic virtues, meaning the cardinal virtues of temperance and justice and wisdom and courage in your life, in your daily life, not just here and there or sort of kind of, but consistently throughout
mm,
your life. And and everything that entails. So if you're overeating or if you're, this and that, any number of other things you can think of, if you're not, you know, uh, if you're not ordering your life fully and completely according to rationality, to get back into that, then you're not living consistently according to the civic virtues. So that's actually a very high it's actually a serious task. And the reality is, and I don't think people really enjoy it when I say this, but I think the reality is that if we're really honest with ourselves, uh, a lot of people probably a lot of people, probably most people are going to be spending a good chunk of their lives just at that level. And that's
yeah.
just fine. It's not like something I think that we need to be upset about, or it doesn't need to be like a sort of competition about, well, I'm up here and you're down here or something like that. Because the
Mm,
reality is, somebody like Proclus, for example, is just way up here, and he's a sort of a freak of nature, and most people are not. Most people just aren't going to be at that level, and it's like that in any spiritual system. It would be like thinking, well, I'm just going to go from being a kind of spiritually interested guy to being a saint or something. Like, okay, well,
right.
that's not a bad goal, but let's be realistic about what's going to happen. So,
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things I think is important about that is the fact that we don't look at it as though you have this one life and you have to figure it all out in this one life. So, if we need to tell somebody, hey, this life, you're going to focus mostly on civic virtue, or, maybe just temperance and courage are the main things that you need to kind of figure out in this life, that's fine for us. It's understandable that you might spend an entire lifetime, and the sort of theme of that lifetime might be something like getting one of those virtues figured out. And you can ascend up the ladder as time goes on in future life. So there isn't this urgency to have it all figured out in this life and right now. And I think that kind of helps takes the edge off a little bit on maybe comparing yourself to other people. You know, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to Proclus or Plotinus. These guys were titans of being sages and philosophers. They're incredible people, but it took them lifetimes upon lifetimes to get to the point that they were at, and we shouldn't really expect that we're just gonna show up one day or in even one short life we're gonna go from 0 to 100. You know?
Yes, and I think one thing about that is you can't cheat yourself. So you can try to go beyond where you are, but you're never really going to be able to do that. So you're not really going to be able to do that. So really, the thing to do is just to be, and part of the spiritual path is learning to be honest with yourself, and because being honest with yourself is part of knowing yourself. And so you have to know yourself and just be realistic, or be straight with yourself, and start where you are. And that's really how you're going to make a lot of progress. I think people can make progress fairly quickly, actually, if they're serious about it. But we have to start with where we are and just move up from that. And maybe so, yeah. But the other thing is uh, sort of related to that, is that I just wanted to emphasize that again, really the civic level of virtue is actually quite high attainment. And
Hmm.
it can sound like, because it's only level three of usually seven, the exact count kind of varies depending on who you're looking at. But so you can look at that and say, oh well, that's only three or something. But actually, that's really quite a high achievement, and probably most people don't, or at least a lot of people don't really get that far along. So it's really pretty big. In fact, I mean, according traditionally, they would say a lot of people aren't going to get anywhere close to that, and some people aren't even capable of doing that. I mean, they don't shy away from, they're not as polite as sometimes as we might be about stuff like this. They don't shy away from saying some people are just not gonna cut it. I mean, I think it was Aristotle who said that you can
Yeah.
throw a rock in the air as many times as you want, it's never gonna fly. So there's something to that idea. But in any
Well, I
case,
think it goes to that idea that, you know, people's souls are different and they're at different points. And some
yeah,
people, this does take time. It's not like you cultivate all of the virtues in a single lifetime. Some people are going to be stuck at a level where they're not even close to being there yet. I think about the people at the grocery store who don't bring their carts back. It's like you have failed civic virtue 101. There's that level of person, and they have other stuff that they got to work on. They probably have to just kind of get outside of themselves a little bit. But yeah, it takes time to kind of build up that that virtue
yeah.
muscle.
And it's totally fine. That's one of the things I try to emphasize, is that this is it's cool, man. Like we don't have to all be like super uh you know having union with the one or something. I mean, that's probably not going to happen for me either. So I'm not like judging. I'm just saying, like let's just be realistic and comfortable with that, and move on. And I think, but yeah, there is this whole system, to get back to earlier question that you asked, that it is in my view a full system. It is a system that is traveled, so to speak, over lifetimes. Uh, uh, Most people will be sort of entering it around the civic level or thereabouts. Some people will be more advanced than that. And but I think it is a complete system. And you have this idea that you start with, as I understand, you have this idea that you start with moral education, and where you're reading these this is what they called it, moral education, and where you're starting with these like maxims and things like that, ethical literature, like the Works and Days and the Golden Verses, and these other texts like that, the Handbook of Epictetus, and so on. And by using these texts, you will sort of, and by they also sort of had the idea that you could like memorize some of these because they're often written, fairly short and
Hmm.
concise statements and whatnot. So you can kind of memorize these and just have them with you. So this is actually kind of spiritual practice in itself, where you can have these maxims, have these sayings, these concepts with you in your everyday life, and sort of check yourself against them. And and there are all sorts of little spiritual practices uh, buried in these uh, texts that you can use. Famously in the Stoic literature, there are all these kind of little ways of thinking about things, and spiritual practices, and stuff like that. So, but
Hmm.
this is where you start. But it's just really the beginning. I mean, the idea is it's really like a university course. And yeah, actually, that's another point to get slightly back to what we were talking about before, is uh, that, jumping into like Proclus is really very much like a first year college student jumping into like heavy physics or something.
Yeah, like
Like,
doctorate work essentially.
exactly. And so it's like it doesn't need to be an ego thing, like or like a judgy thing, like, oh, you're not ready for that or something like that. And I don't
Right.
want to come across like that. It's just that like it's really the same as like going to college. Like you're gonna do it in order. You're gonna go
Right.
to college and you're gonna take your basic courses and you're gonna build up from that. And
Right. You're
eventually
not
you will
like
be.
a bad freshman because you don't understand what the doctorate students are doing. You just have
Exactly.
to step through it bit by bit so
Right.
that by the time you get to that, it actually makes sense and you're not completely lost. And yeah, there is that tendency to jump to the highest thing and almost work your way down. And so that's why I think it's so important to have works like this where there is the introductory stuff there that people can dive into and take that first step. And like you said, it doesn't need to be a judgy thing. It is really something where we all have to step through this, and part of it is, I think, reassessing things we think we already know. It reminds me a lot of First Alcibiades, where Alcibiades is kind of learning that he thinks he knows what the right thing to do is, but he doesn't really know, and he's got to actually go through this process of learning. And I think we all need to do that in that first step, where maybe we think we know what civic virtue is, or we think we understand morality because of just picking this stuff up as we grew up. But I think what we find when we actually jump into the text like this is that the things we thought we knew, we probably didn't. And we do have to go through even a bit of a fundamental re education or reorientation. And it's really our first reorientation to the good, ultimately. We're reorienting our morals, we're reorienting our relationships with others to align itself better with the good.
I think you put it very well. I think that's exactly what it is. And they had this whole process worked out where you would start with this moral level, and it would include you mentioned earlier, it would include the physical exercise and things, and taking care of your health, and all that kind of stuff. They also had a musical component. They had spiritual music, which is particularly associated with the Pythagoreans, but not only. And Plato talks about it also.
Mhm.
And and so they had this kind of thing. And then and then from there you would start getting into more of the kind of sciencey, mathy stuff. This is how it would traditionally go, as I understand. You would one thing that would be traditional at this point would be going through Aristotle, the philosophy and science of Aristotle, starting with the logic, learning the logic. Of course, especially for them, Aristotle practically was logic, although there was Stoic
Mhm.
logic and stuff like that. But in any case, you would go through logic, and then you would go basically through all of Aristotle, more or less, culminating in the theology of Aristotle, basically the metaphysics. And then you would start with going through the dialogues of Plato, and they had this iamblichean order, which is they had other things, but this is kind of one of the traditional reading order ways of reading the dialogues, where you would start with the Alcibiades, as you said, and then go through the whole series, culminating in the Parmenides, and you would be attending lectures, and we have fortunately a fair number of commentaries left, on not on all of them, but on some of them. And
Mhm.
so it'd be going through all these things, and then at the end of that, you would be sort of initiated, you might say, into dialectic. And
Mhm.
Plato calls dialectic the capstone of philosophy. And but you only traditionally get to that point after doing all this other stuff. And then it is at that point that you start, it is really at that point that you're truly a philosopher and start truly living the life of a philosopher. And that's kind of more or less how I understand that working. And this is all, uh, as I say, sort of map to levels of consciousness or knowledge. So
Mhm.
you're going up. This gets back to something we talked about earlier with rationality, and where rationality fits into things. Uh, you're really starting at the level, as I understand, at the level of opinion, or as they say, doxa. And and this also, you can also think of this in terms of the cave allegory, the famous cave allegory of Plato, where which I'm sure most people are familiar with. But in the
Yeah.
cave
If you're listening
allegory,
to a podcast called The Platonists, I hope you're aware of the allegory of the cave. If not, Google it
just in case,
just in
you
case.
know, the yeah, yeah, in the cave allegory, you're starting at the sort of looking at the wall, and it's got the shadows on the wall and everything, and then you remove the shackles and turn around, and then you start this process of going up the path, the sort of firelit path, and up and eventually up and out of the mouth of the cave, out into the nature, and you start looking at the during the nighttime, you start looking around and you start looking at the reflections in the water, and then eventually you can look at things during the daytime as your eyes adjust, and then eventually you can even gaze at the sun itself.
And
And
really that's a ends up being a metaphor for knowledge, right? Coming kind of coming to true knowledge.
I think that's absolutely a big part of what it's about. And it's about not only that there are these levels of knowledge, but that we can ascend through them ourselves if we follow this path, this spiritual practice. And so this spiritual practice maps onto that cave ascension, where you're starting basically at the level of opinion. Opinion is not a bad thing. Opinion is only bad if it's false opinion. If it's true opinion, then it's good. So you have to start by learning true opinion. And that's basically the purpose of reading these texts, like the Golden Verses, like the Works and Days, and the Handbook, and the Poetry of Theognis would be another example that they recommended. And so by reading these regularly and absorbing them and sort of using them throughout your life, that's what you're doing. You're acquiring true opinion.
Well,
And that,
yeah.
and
And I think it's interesting that that's literally what the term orthodox means, right? It's the
oh,
correct opinion.
yeah.
And
Okay.
it's funny to think about it as this is kind of the, I guess, orthodox Platonism, but in the sense that
Yeah.
you're gaining the true beliefs.
I think that's the idea. And then once you've done that, then you move up to the rational. And it's at that point that you start learning rationally about the world through mathematics and science. And as I say, traditionally that would be more or less Aristotle. And but it would also include other things, study of geometry and things and that kind of stuff. But basically you're studying math and science, and this is at the sort of getting to the level of rational and slightly moving towards the end of it, even moving slightly beyond the rest, moving towards intellect eventually. But this is essentially at the rational level. And uh, so we mentioned
Can,
earlier that this can be.
can I stop you right there? I feel like it's worth kind of drawing out maybe the difference between the rational and the intellect, because I think a lot of people today hear those terms and they just think that rationality and intellect is the same thing, right? Like they hear about a person who's an intellectual and they think, okay, that must mean that person's very rational. They think a lot, but I
Oh
know
yeah.
that's probably not what you meant by the terms, right?
Not exactly, but they yeah. So in the Platonic tradition, intellect has actually. I think this is one of those terminological things that can be confusing for people. It was confusing for me when I was starting. Yeah. So intellect tends to mean something more like intuition, a sort of intuitive knowledge, a sort of immediate comprehensive knowing. It's sort of the another way of thinking about it is it's sort of the pinnacle of rationality. It's sort of the how do you know that something is how do you like what is it when you know something? That's not exactly rationality. Rationality is this sort of moving from premise to conclusion
Mm-hmm. It's
type
kind
thinking.
of propositional in a way that knowledge for us as Platonists really isn't a proposition. It's something you grasp directly.
Yeah, exactly. So by rationality, I guess we mean in this tradition something pretty close to what people ordinarily mean by it. This kind of scientific type thinking, logical thinking, and that kind of thing. But intellect is something a little more yeah, intuitive. It's something, and it's higher than rationality. So rationality is kind of leading us to intellect. Actually, was the idea, but so that's how I understand that. But the but in any case, we once we have gone through this sort of moral program, moral education, or as we mentioned earlier, moral purification, because that's the other way of looking at it. Because as I said, education and purification to them are more or less the same thing. And so you are purifying yourself. Now, actually, you can stop there and say, what are you purifying exactly? Purifying yourself, but what does that mean? Well, this gets into the tripartite soul, of course, because in Platonism you have this traditional concept of the tripartite soul. Basically, you have the rational and the irrational soul, and the irrational soul consists of two major pieces, and one of which is the part of you that desires and has appetites for food and sex and whatnot, and the other part is this sort of you could call it willful part, the part of you that gets angry
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing. The spirited part is the traditional English term. Uh, the spirited soul and the appetitive soul. Those are the two irrational parts of the tripartite soul, and then the third part is the rational soul. So if you think about what's going on in this process of education, uh, and if you flip to thinking of it as purification, then what you're doing is you're purifying different parts of the soul. You start by purifying the irrational soul. And the way you purify the irrational soul is by acquiring the cardinal virtues at the civic level. And so this is the way that, and there's also a component of the sort of caring for your body and all this stuff fits into that too. But essentially, you're purifying your irrational soul by acquiring the cardinal virtues, which and one of the traditional ways of doing that is by uh, uh, using these texts and acquiring the true opinion and living that and all that kind of thing. Then once you've done that and you move to the next phase in the program where you're starting to do this more intellectual or rational stuff with the Aristotelian science and the mathematics and all that kind of stuff, you're activating the more rational side. But actually, what you're doing is purifying your rational soul. And there's even Heracles says is pretty clear about this in his commentary on the Golden Verses that you not only are you purifying your rational soul by, in other words, learning these things like logic and so on and so forth is a purification. And I think that's a concept that it sounds, at least to me, it initially sounded a little strange,
Mm-hmm.
but uh, but I think it makes a lot of sense. But they have, but in any case, learning logic, learning these geometry, for example, Aristotelian science, this is purifying your rational soul. You've already purified your irrational soul. Now you're purifying your rational soul. And but there's also in parallel with this, there's a uh, and this is very clear in Heracles. There's they had the idea of um, there's various terms for this, but you have kind of this. Sometimes it's called the soulish body, or sometimes it's
Mm-hmm.
called the somatic vehicle, or uh, there's also the astral body, which is kind of along these similar lines, and the luminous vehicle, I think, is another term. Anyway, there's various terms, but
Yeah.
basically you have this kind of like intermediate soul body. Uh,
And that's something that's kind of, it's not your soul necessarily, but it's not your body, right? It's like something like sometimes when I think about it, I think when you imagine like a ghost, this kind of like vaporous, it's not really a physical body, but it's not really a soul necessarily in its pure essence. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think the what we tend to think of as the soul, as this kind of ghostly thing, is something more akin to what they would have called the vehicle of the soul, or
Hmm.
whatever term. And but in any case, they have this idea that you must also purify that. So you have to purify your tripartite soul, and then you have to purify, but you also have to purify the vehicle of the soul. It's called the vehicle because it's carrying the soul. So this is the idea, uh, and so this purification of the soul's vehicle happens in parallel uh, at each phase. So at the first stage, when you're doing this is my understanding, at the first stage, when you're doing this moral purification, which is, as we said, that's purifying your irrational soul, your appetites and things of that kind. You're also purifying your soul's vehicle by, and the way that you accomplish that basically is by taking care of your body, because the uh, the the soul's vehicle is uh, more body-like than your actual soul. And so by doing things like, for example, fasting, one of the main things that they recommend is control. Not doesn't necessarily have to be fasting, but controlling your appetite, and being very controlled in how you eat, and not overeating at all, or even sort of to some extent fasting and things like this, eating the correct foods that Pythagoreans famously had certain dietary rules and things like that. So by doing these things, you will begin the purification of the luminous uh, body, or the vehicle of the soul. And but then uh, also, once you move on to the rational uh, soul, the purification or education of the rational soul, there's an accompanying ritual component. And this is where you get into what kind of starts to get into what is termed like theurgy, or
Mm.
ritual, in the sense, theurgy in the sense of like physical ritual, where you might be using incense and statues and herbs and various things of that kind, these kinds of rituals. And this type of ritual is, in the Platonic understanding, is specifically uh, for the purpose of purifying the luminous, I keep saying luminous body, but the vehicle of the soul. That's one term for it, but the vehicle of the soul.
But
Uh,
are you saying that's higher? So like you have there's different kind of bodies there. So there's the pneumatic kind of vehicle that maybe is the more ghostly one. Is the luminous the same thing, or is that something
there were different
higher
views
above that?
on. Oh, sorry.
No,
The,
go ahead.
there were different, yeah, there were different views on kind of exactly how this spirit body thing worked. And Proclus even thought there were two different ones. Heracles, I think, just thought there was one. Porphyry seemed to think that it was more of the astral body, but be that as it may, the basic idea is that you have to, as I understand it, is that you do have to do these purifications in parallel, and that the first part of that is the kind of dietary level, and then the second part of that is more like the doing actual rituals, and
Yeah.
that part uh, specifically designed to purify this vehicle of the soul, but at the
Well,
rat. Uh,
and I think that's so interesting because kind of similar to the idea that people jump into Platonism and they go straight to Proclus, there's this other trend I see a lot of times where people jump in and they go straight for the theurgy books and straight for the rituals and all of that. And nobody wants to do the moral and civic part first, right? If you told people, okay, step one for theurgy is you're going to fast for 3 days, most people will be like, oh, I'm not interested in that part. I just want to do the fun rituals with the incense and all of that. But, what you're saying is these things kind of have to happen in a bit of a sequence. You have to work on these other parts before the later parts are really going to be effective the way that they should be, right?
I believe that's true, and uh, I think they actually, so this would be a point at which I think there's a little bit of, I don't know, maybe disagreement, I guess, between this perspective on things, and how, in the general pagan, I don't want this to sound like I'm judging too much, but in the general pagan sphere, there tends to be very much a focus on ritual, and
Mm.
sort of ritual is like, not only that it's important, but it's kind of like the main thing, and that's like really the most important thing, and the sort of the first thing you do.
Yeah, and
Whereas in this,
I think it's interesting that you hear it a lot of times where people say that this religion is orthopractic, right? It's about the correct practices. It's not about orthodoxy. And it doesn't, it seems like that's
Mhm.
not necessarily the case. You know, we've been talking about having the correct beliefs as a part of that too.
Having the correct beliefs is an essential part of it. At least, I mean, that is the traditional, that is the understanding of this tradition. And I think it makes sense. I mean, a good example of that is it's not a, you don't even have to look at the Platonic literature. Epictetus says that quite straightforwardly in the handbook in section 31. I think he says that the most, or he says the essence of piety is having the right opinion about the gods, that they are just and that they govern the universe properly and whatnot, and that they exist. So, according to Epictetus, who was a Stoic, this is the essence of piety is to have these correct opinions that gods exist and that they're good and that they govern the universe well. And now he then goes on to say, yes, you should also do first fruit offerings and things of that kind. So he's not leaving that out, but he is saying that not only is it important, it's actually fundamental to have the right opinions about these things. And but yeah, the
I mean, it
the
makes
way you're
sense when you think about it. Like, I think if you applied it to anything else in life, it seems kind of obvious. Like, even if I were trying to become a plumber or something, it's like, yeah, you know, doing plumbing is important and knowing the skills that are involved with piping and all of this. But if I believe that water just naturally flies upward whenever I put a pipe somewhere, well, that's not going to help me. Like, I'm not going to do my plumbing correctly if I don't understand the principles behind it and have some sort of basic knowledge. And I think that's the difference where, like, we're not asking people to believe in necessarily this particular revelation, or we're not asking them to believe in anything that's irrational, but there are correct beliefs and there are incorrect beliefs about these things.
I think that's exactly right. And they actually go a little further than that. And this might be the somewhat more controversial part. Not only do they think that you must have the right opinions, they think that you must be purified and before you do these things. And so then now that in and of itself is actually uh, not exclusively Platonic or Pythagorean. I mean, the general Greek culture had this idea of pollution, miasma, and
Mm.
but this tended to be outside of the philosophical schools, as I understand. This tended to be, I mean, more in like just sort of the pop culture. This tended to be more about the literal physical body and being physically clean and certain other
Yeah, kind of
requirements,
hygiene.
yeah, hygiene type stuff. And so the philosophical schools expanded on that. They included that, but they also said actually it's even what's even more important than being literally physically clean is being spiritually clean.
You
You
know,
must be
what
clean.
pollutes your soul?
Yeah, you have to remove the pollution of your soul. And so then the question is, well, what does that mean, or how do you do that? And the answer is basically everything we've just been talking about. So you go through this process of acquiring the cardinal virtues at the civic level, and that is purification. And then it's not purification of the entire soul, but it's purification of the lower soul or the irrational soul. And then at that point, you would start doing, this is my understanding, at that point, you would start doing these rituals and whatnot. And Simplicius, the philosopher Simplicius, who wrote a commentary on the handbook, he discusses that part of Epictetus, and he makes it very clear that when you do the first fruit offerings and whatnot, after the sort of purification occurs, uh, and Simplicius, by the way, also very uh, explicitly places the handbook at the civic level of virtue. So I think that this is the way they did it. This was the kind of philosophical understanding of how that worked.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating, and it's great that we've got this work where we can actually start getting back to what they were doing in antiquity, and that kind of leads to one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, which was just about it seems like there's and this idea that paganism and Platonism is very fragmentary, and we don't have enough information to really reconstruct these things. And that's led a lot of people to decide to go towards things like Buddhism and Hinduism, which are great traditions, I think, but kind of merge them together into paganism and create these kind of uh, hybrid practices between the two. And I'm really not against anybody who wants to do that necessarily, so long as it's effective for them, I guess. But it really sounds like what you're saying here is, we don't necessarily need to do that, right? Like we do have enough to start constructing this and doing it the way that they actually did it in antiquity.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and I think that's one of the most important things to say at this point. Um, yeah, I'm like you. I'm not trying to take people's yoga mats away or something like that. I don't
Sure.
have a problem with that, but in principle, but at the same time, I think a certain amount of that is motivated by the what I believe to be the wrong, uh, the incorrect idea that we have to do that stuff because we don't have anything.
Hmm.
Actually, another example of that would be a different kind of example would be the traditional medicine. Traditional medicine is kind of popular these days, and with like the Chinese folk medicine and
Hmm.
Ayurveda and whatnot. And a lot of people don't understand that we have our own traditional medicine. In fact, Western medicine just was traditional medicine until really not all that long ago, up until around, scientific revolution, things started changing and whatnot. But it really hasn't been that long ago that we were using what was effectively Hippocratic science, which was, in other words, Greek science, and which was actually quite similar. But that's just another sort of
Yeah,
an
but
aside. But
it's similar, right? Like we have that same uh, I don't know, like lack mindset about it. That, oh, we have to go over to Ayurveda or we have to go to Chinese medicine because we don't have anything like that in the West. We don't have traditional medicines. And I
right.
think when people think of traditional Western medicine, they just think of like leeches and bloodletting and lobotomies, maybe, like things that just didn't work, I guess. But I don't know. I guess leeches probably did actually work. But yeah, you're right. There are these sort of Hippocratic systems, and we had all of these traditional medicine systems here that we've really buried and forgotten. And some of them have come back in interesting ways. Like my wife is into homeopathy, and the other
Mm.
day she was talking about it and mentioned miasms. I guess in homeopathy they talk about miasms. I'm like, you know what that means, right? And I was explaining kind of the pollution of the soul, and they're like, yeah, it's your vital force is weakened. And I'm like, you're just talking about pollution of the soul in a different term, right? So
Yeah.
we've got these systems there, and I think part of the revival of paganism and Platonism should really involve revival of really complete systems, and part of that obviously being health is a huge part of that. But back to the spirituality part. Yeah, not yanking yoga mats away from people, but it's cool to see that we've got this ability to do this sort of in our own house. And the one thing that I think maybe is difficult for people is it seems like our the way we understand spirituality has been colored by neo-Hinduism, the Beatles in the 60s, and um, that kind of explosion of these Eastern systems. And Do you see that being a challenge for anybody at this point, that maybe they've got a kind of an Eastern mindset that they're trying to apply to this path?
I think that's one of the challenges. I think we have two big challenges in this regard. One being the Eastern part, and one being our own sort of cultural revolution that we went through around the time of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and everything that fell out of or came out of that. And so a lot of our challenges are related to that. Uh, People tend, we've already talked a little bit about this, but people tend to, including me early on, tend to get trapped and tend to get tripped up on, the rationality thing. And they think, because we very much, and this is directly a result of all the stuff coming out of the Enlightenment, we and post enlightenment, we tend to think that rationality is opposed to spirituality, that there's somehow these like polar opposites or something like that. So we have a lot of challenges coming out of that stuff that are sort of part of our own cultural baggage, if you will. And then in addition to that, as you say, we have the sort of Eastern stuff that's come in particular since the 60s and 40s and 60s, 50s. And I think that's part of the challenge too. And in some ways, oddly enough, I even find myself earlier. I talked about ascending through levels of consciousness. That's an Eastern way of speaking. I would
Hmm.
the more really traditional way of speaking would be levels of knowledge or something like that. And or people will talk about enlightenment and stuff. So it is what it is. But I do think that that this can present a challenge, and I think, or I hope that people start seeing, well, actually, we kind of have our own thing, and once you start looking into it, it actually feel it. There's this odd thing where it feels foreign and very familiar at the same time when you start getting into this stuff, and it's almost like kind of feels like coming home in a way. But yeah, like as you mentioned earlier, I do think about the sort of trying to pull in things from Buddhism or what have you. In principle, I'm not opposed to that, but I just want people to understand that we don't have to do that. We really have, I would say, now, I won't say that we have absolutely everything. I think that would be going too far, but
Hmm.
just was some things were lost. But what I will say is I think we have 95% of it. I really don't think we're missing much. Now,
Right. It's
the
more like
challenge,
that people are looking at it hoping they're going to find something analogous to maybe the Eastern works, and they're just kind of expecting to find something that isn't necessarily there, but at the same time kind of missing the gems that are right in front of our face at the same time.
oh, I think that's one of the things, one of the biggest challenges is just letting this tradition be what it is. That's one of the major lessons that I've learned myself over the years, is learning how to just read these texts and let them tell me what they are, rather than trying to bring in my own assumptions about that I'm supposed to find breath exercises or whatever it might be.
Right.
And when I don't find that, then I think, well, that means there's something missing. And actually, it's really all there. I just have to be able to see it as it is. I have to be able to see it for itself and let them speak to me and just listen to them. And I have found consistently that when I do that, I realize there's really not any, or there's very little missing.
Yeah.
Even now, it's scattered here, there, and everywhere throughout the text. There isn't like how to be a pagan Platonist 101 by Proclus or something like that. But
Be nice.
yeah, it'd be nice. Uh, so there's a lot of work which we're still in the process of doing this work. But I think we've made tremendous progress. But so there's a lot of work in kind of bringing all that together and presenting it in a coherent clear way, but it is there and it can be done, and we are doing it. And so I don't think we need to bring this stuff in. You can do it if you want to, but we don't need it. We have our own path. It's a different path, and it sort of it's just its own different thing. It came from a different civilization, our civilization, but so it's different, but it's all there. And that's what I think one of the things that I think is most important for people to understand, that we really do have our own spiritual tradition, non-Christian. We have a non-Christian spiritual tradition that I think we have at bare minimum 90% of it is there. And I think really more than that, probably more like 95% of it. There's, as I say, a lot of work in bringing it together, but it's there. And I think we are very, very close. I really think we are very, very close to getting to a point where, for the first time in 1,500 years, we are able to present this Western spirituality on its own terms in a clear way that people can actually not just learn about in some sort of academic way, but practice as a spirituality.
Yeah. And I think you're a huge part of that because you're absolutely right that you've let the tradition speak for itself. And that's something that's so unique right now. There's a lot of people, myself included, I kind of brought my personal experience to the book that I wrote as a way for spiritual practice. But, you've got such a exacting mind and the trust in the system to read the works directly and really let them speak for themselves. And I think that's something that everyone's going to get a lot out of. And I'm really excited for the future books that you're going to make too, because I think this one's a great start. So, with that, where can people find this work? Is it for print yet, or where can they
Uh,
get it?
so currently it's available for free as a PDF on my channel, Classical Wisdom Tradition, on Telegram. So anybody can go there and just download it for free. Now there will be I'm in the process of putting together, this physical copy, and it's not quite ready yet. I'm still kind of editing it and stuff like that, but I'm planning on releasing that for sale uh, probably early next year sometime. And I'll be announcing the details of that when it's ready in the channel.
Great. Well, I'll share the link so people can find that and find your channel. And it's great talking to you about this. It's always interesting talking to you about Platonism, and you've got such an interesting perspective on it, and your dedication to it and your dedication to letting it be what it is and developing our traditions is something that's so important today. And I think people are going to get a lot out of it. So appreciate you being here.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.